Hello and welcome to Fly to Freedom. Today we're going to dive deep into a real raw conversation about not just recovery and healing, but the bigger systems that shape our relationships with food, body, and ourselves. Today I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Lucy Aphramor, who is a radical dietitian, poet, and a leading voice in challenging the dominant narratives around health and nutrition. Rather than reading a formal bio, I'm going to ask Lucy to introduce themselves in their own words. But to give you a little bit of context, Lucy's work is deeply rooted in justice and liberation. Their Well Now philosophy bridges self-care with social change, and they've spent over 2 decades reshaping how we think about food, health, and bodies, centering the voices of those most marginalized. In today's conversation, we'll be exploring some really powerful and important themes: how public health nutrition is an equity issue, the ways in which traditional health education reinforces oppression rather than dismantling it, and how socially engaged pedagogy can shift the way we think about healing and liberation. Lucy's message goes far beyond individual well-being. It's about collective transformation. Their work challenges us not to just settle for surface-level shifts, but to notice and dismantle the deep logic of oppression that keeps these harmful systems in place. Lucy, welcome. I would love for you to start sharing a bit about yourself in your own words, who you are, the journey that led you to this work, and what's most alive for you right now.
Thank you. Thank you for that sterling introduction. That's so generous of you. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And thank you for your work. It's so important that we have more stories, that we can contribute to collective knowledge building, in whatever way that we're best suited to do that. So I really appreciate you taking the time for this. Thank you. Where to start? So I think there's a way of like sharing information and writing bios where it can remove context. And so I just wanted, and I think like a lot of what I say is things that I'm not saying I haven't done them myself, but it's things that I've learned. So the whole process of learning and then unlearning, and like noticing what I've been doing that I don't think is helpful and how do I try and shift it, and how important it is to recognize that my own work, and of course all of our work, it doesn't come from nowhere. It rests on a lineage and a context. And for a long time, I hadn't realized how much of my work rested on fact scholarship, because it'd been presented to me as biomedicine. And biomedicine had been presented as, or I should say misrepresented, as this sort of neutral, value-free system.
I think that's what we're all taught to believe, though,
it's
isn't
exactly what we're taught to believe, yeah. And even within that, if I think of like ethics, that we were taught, the thing of like biomedical ethics, do no harm. But of course, that completely from the outset removes the fact that we live in oppressive systems where some people have always been privileged and some people are always being harmed. So, yeah. And then so I would like always training myself. What does this mean for knowledge creation? And then, so using an ethics, I think of like reckoning, care, and repair. So like, where have I made missteps and what am I going to do about it? And what does that mean collectively? But just going back, like, how did I get into this work? So I've got various versions, which are all true. I think, what version should I give? But of course, they're all like partial truths. So so the version that I told for a long time was that I'd always been interested in food and growing, which is totally true. So I did a dietetics degree at university, and I would spend a lot of my weekends with this organisation called Willing Workers on Organic Farms, or WWOOF. So I'd just go away for the weekend and, like work hard on people's small holdings. It was fabulous.
I love that.
It's really great. It's still going.
My husband, My husband has a blueberry farm,
Oh,
so
really? Oh, cool.
yeah, I
Yeah. Oh,
absolutely love
yeah.
that.
And it was like I've been cooped up in lectures all week, so I would just go there and like work really, really hard, and I'd get through all of the tasks, you know, that had been allocated for me in no time because I was like so desperate just to get out and get on. I think also to get onto the land, although I hadn't theorized it like that for myself at the time. It was more like through movement and, you know, anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I'd always been interested, and then so I finished my degree, and I went off traveling, and came back like 7, 8 years later, and I actually ran a market garden for a while. Not very well, I hasten to add. I did do it, and then I did a return to the profession course and went into dietetics, and pretty soon on, I realised that I was missing something really big. And I had no idea what it was, but things just didn't feel right. And there was maybe there are 3 different things that it cohered, that this unease, this disquiet cohered around. One of them was that when I was asked to see people for weight management, that what I had been taught was clearly like inappropriate and not always relevant, even without a critical understanding. Because a lot of the people that I was seeing, they already were eating a really low energy diet, and there wasn't any scope for increased activity. It wasn't a thing. So there was like a real limit, this one model that I had. And then when we did look, if we did look at energy deficit, it just either like it didn't, when I say, I sort of hesitate to say it didn't work, it was more than that, that people were really distressed by it. They'd tried it before. And it wasn't it wasn't improving people's well-being, and people were no happier for it. So there was this thing so I began to think, like, what am I missing here? So one thing was that the whole thing around dieting was, there was something clearly really, really wrong with it, and I didn't know what it was. The second thing was that people's stories of what I would now call fat miseria, but at the time I was calling size discrimination or fat stigma. And people would burst into tears because I hadn't disrespected them. And it just made me, it was just it was heartbreaking, and just wrong. It was just like, what are we doing here? And I could, again, without being able to clearly articulate it, I could see that what I was offering was part of the problem. And then the third thing was, I was sat in a lunchtime meeting one day. It was a big department, like 30 people. And we were talking about high rates of heart disease in South Asian men locally. And in the UK, South Asian men is used to mean people from Indian, Bangladeshi, Pakistani origin. It's like all, you know, yeah, it all needs attention. Just to let you know the populations I'm talking about. And in so the local rate of heart disease was double that of the general population, which is typical across the UK.
Wow.
And yeah, and you can imagine what our conversation centered on. So the first thing we do, you know, we know, yeah, we weren't there, we totally know what we talked about. So diet, particularly ghee, yeah. So we conjure up this stereotype, like this caricatured image of a larger, you know, a fat South Asian man eating ghee, who's sedentary. Yeah, that's what happens, yeah. And and I'm thinking to myself, what shift somebody moves from like the Indian subcontinent to where I was like working, this inner city in England, like apart from the weather, and I'm thinking, racism, anyone? Racism? But I had no way of making sense of it beyond racism means people get paid poorly. So beyond that sort of behavioural thing, but we're still like demonised diet, you know, so the whole them and us thing, they eat the wrong diet, this whole thing going on. So I went away and I just Googled racism and heart disease, and I got 3 hits that radically changed my practice. I got a hit to status syndrome from researcher Michael Marmot, whose work shows, so he's did some studies in the 1950s, well, starting in the 1950s, with longitudinal data from there on, that originally looked at men and then looked at men and women. I don't think they've looked at non-binary folk yet. But it showed that if you can, so they went into Whitehall in the 1950s, where overwhelmingly it's white men. And the biggest difference between them, between the doormen that they had then and the cleaners and the secretaries, and then middle management and upper management, is class. And sort of stripping it down, what the research showed is that class exerts an impact on health outcomes above and beyond that which can be explained by traditional health behaviours. So otherwise classism, yeah, that people are protected, upper class people are protected by class privilege, and working class people, their health suffers because of classism, even if we all eat the same.
Yeah. I imagine that stress has got a lot to do with that.
So this is it, yeah. So these are the pathways. So there is the behavioural pathway, but there's also these other pathways that happen through power and privilege. Yeah. So that just I could no longer practice as I was practicing, and I went to, at the time, luckily for me, there was one main weight management document signed 1996. So I got all the primary data where it said lose weight because it's great, or this is how you lose weight. And there wasn't a single instance where the primary data had, where claims made in the document accurately represented the primary data. So I just knew that I could no longer do weight management. It wasn't ethical. So I began to develop, to focus on correcting the myths that people have been told there, bringing in, getting a vocabulary and finding ways of bringing in this fact that diet makes a difference, and there's so much more than that always going on, and trying to do something about what I was still then calling size discrimination. So that's the story that I would generally give, but within that I've had a really complicated relationship with food. Like a lot of my early life, I had a really hard time with my relationship with food, and also with gut problems. And what I did in my practice was, as I would figure things out for myself, I would try and figure out, how can I teach that? How can I pass this knowledge on? And that's been an ongoing, that pedagogy. So pedagogy is like teaching style. Like, how can I make this useful? And I realised that I would often not put that in. And of course, that's been really crucial. Sorry,
I really love this. You have got an amazing connection to yourself, even before you realised it. With you saying about going out and working on the farms and stuff, your body and your soul were telling you this is what you needed to do, even though you didn't really know why. And you've demonstrated how deeply you're connected to yourself throughout your story there, which is incredibly beautiful and quite rare. And I think how you've noticed things that are difficult and said, okay, what can I learn from this and how can I teach from this, is a gift. And I absolutely love that. It's brilliant. You did mention the myths about weight management and stuff. Can we have a bit of a chat about them? Because, I mean, there are so many myths out there. In my own mind, I kind of feel like in all this weight management, diet culture, and all that bullshit, it's kind of been lost of how clever our own bodies are and how they adapt to whatever we put into them. So if we reduce what we eat, the body reduces what it uses. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to lose weight. It just means things are going to slow down. And that seems to have been forgotten as well. So what myths were you referring to when you said the myths of diet culture? And
so I think one that's an entry point. And thank you also for that, for the what you just offered there around the fact that I can listen to myself, because I've never thought of it like that before.
So many people don't. We're taught not to, I think.
Well, we're not, because that's what I also think, like, I'm not the only dietitian who sat with clients hearing these stories. I'm not the only dietitian who's felt this, who's heard these stories. And I know there's lots of other people questioning it now, but at the time there was nobody else in the UK I could have a conversation with. And it's like, what goes wrong in our education that teaches us to repress what we know to be true? Like, we know there's something wrong here. That's the truth that we know. And that's really, I think that's really important, that we keep surfacing that.
Yeah, as children, we're taught not to listen to our hunger and fullness signals.
Yeah.
Like, I remember being told you're not allowed to leave the table till you finish that food. And you're not allowed to have this until you've had that and stuff like that, which is literally teaching a child to not listen to their own body signals.
Yeah. Yeah. So going back to the myth, the myth that's often an entry point is somebody comes to see me and they want to lose weight. And I'll ask them, have you tried before? And yes, they've tried for decades to do it. And I'm like, well, how does it go? And they tell me all the diets. And they lose weight and then they put it back on and then some. And when I ask, do you know why that is? Very often it's self-blame in that. There's a whole a litany of self-blame, and also life circumstances where it was really tricky what they were doing, or really time-consuming, expensive, and they were no longer able to follow this regime. So then I'd ask, lots of people when I began practice, lots of people told me that, and so I looked into the research on it. Do you want me, to share a bit about that? And then to explain that although we hear all the time that eating less and moving more is proven to lead to safe long-term weight loss, and that in itself has health benefits, because I think that's never questioned either, that in fact, if we look at the research, and what I mean by this, so as a dietitian, we're told to use evidence-based practice, and the best available evidence, according to this protocol, comes from, if I sort of if I simplify the research but keep the results the same, it would be, we've got 100 people, divide them into two groups. One group is the feel-good group, and the other group is the lose a few pounds. 50 people in the feel-good group meet up once a week for 2 years, and they're just going to feel good. So they might laughter yoga, book club, tending grief, chocolate fondue, I don't know, macrame, woodwork, whatever it is, they're just going to meet up, yeah? And the other group are just going to lose a few pounds. Nothing silly, no fat suits, no drugs, no taking up, sweatsuits, no taking up smoking, no, nothing deemed extreme, just healthy, sensible eating, according to the, whatever's out there. If they meet up in 2 years' time, what's happened to the weight of the feel-good group, you think?
I actually imagine it's gone down.
So if we look, so according to the evidence, it's probably about the same, yeah. And how are they feeling?
Good.
Yeah, probably, yeah. Social contact, great. What about the lose a few pounds? What's likely happened to their weight?
It's probably gone up.
Everybody?
No, there will be some people that it's gone down, but they will be quite miserable and feeling quite anxious, I imagine.
Yeah. So how's the group as a whole feeling?
Not very good about themselves, I don't expect.
Yeah. And that is what the research shows. That so the Women's Health Initiative debunks the idea that we've got to do something because people are going to inexorably get fatter, and that's a bad thing. And so it doesn't. So people didn't put weight on without intervention. And then also the Manetel paper shows that intentional weight loss. So the summary is that the benefits of trying to lose weight are too small and the potential harms are too great for it to be recommended as a safe and effective treatment. And that is the best available evidence according to evidence-based practice. So that's not the same as saying nobody ever loses weight, but it is saying that it is not an evidence-based recommendation to tell people to cut calories to lose weight. You know, the smokers that live to 100. No. So this is what I've explained to people, that in the short term, what the evidence shows is that short-term weight loss is relatively easy to achieve, but we don't know that that leads to any sort of health improvement.
No, we're all told it will, and we're all told we'll be happy then as well.
Yeah, and it's not, and that's not challenged. It's just assumed that weight loss equals health improvement. Yeah. And the psychology and bone mass doesn't get a look in. What I've noticed over time in the British recommendations as well, that adverse effects are just being dropped. When I first started looking, you could do a search and find for bone, and you'd get the references that referred to bone loss with calorie deficit, and they just don't appear anymore.
Why do you think that is? Why is this consistently pushed and pushed and pushed when there is so much evidence to say that it is harmful, let alone not helpful, but harmful to people's physical, emotional, and mental health? Why is it continually pushed?
Because I think if you challenge that, you're challenging a whole system. You're challenging a whole ideology that thinks within those parameters. So I think of this: if I'm doing a talk like at a postgrad, to a group of a conference or something to postgrads, and I point out, or I ask people, what's the impact of having like healthy eating messages on the people that you're working with? Students are often postgrad researchers are often working with marginalized communities. What's the impact? And for a lot of people, they are working with these communities and they're like, well, they feel terrible or they can't meet it. Do I think anybody goes back and changes their PhD? Because what's at stake? And this is why it needs to be collective. It's not like trying to single out terrible people, but we have to have mechanisms for saying, this goes really deep. How are we going to figure out what to do? So reckoning care and repair. So it means like changing, they should never get through ethics. Weight management should never get through ethical approval. But if you say that, you're challenging a whole system of hierarchy and status. So it's looking at the knowledge creation systems. And within that, what does it feel like to say, okay, so that's whatever my career is, 30 years of my career, I've been saying something that I now doubt. That's big. So we have to be ready to support each other with those changes.
I love the way you said support each other, because within weight management and socially acceptable norms, we're made to feel that everything is our fault, our responsibility, and very alone and isolated in this whole thing. Yet it affects millions. How can we look at the bigger picture? And how can we not feel so alone in all this?
So I think that, and also that this could be the case, there might be listeners who the way that they get through the day is by following a really rigid diet. And they're intending weight loss, yeah? And so just to say that I'm not, that people find what for them at the time is their good medicine. And I'm never trying to argue somebody out of what they're doing. Because to assume that somebody always has, there's another choice that somebody could make, that this whole thing is better for them. I don't know that. And you can't,
that's true.
So it's like to meet people where they are, recognizing they might always follow calorie controlled diets, but within that, to let people know that that none of that has any bearing on people's worthiness of respect, on people's right to dignity and effective care. Yeah, that these things, because that just becomes a moral judgment. Unless you follow my agenda, I'm not here for you. Not an okay
Yeah.
thing. So yeah, let's tackle oppression. Yeah, if my agenda is to tackle oppression, then let's do that. But imposing an agenda on what people should or shouldn't eat is itself oppressive.
Yes. Yeah. How much do you think the world we live in has affected eating disorders? Because I know when I was living in anorexia, I thought, I genuinely thought that I was doing the right thing with a lot of the practices I did. I thought I was doing it for my health. I convinced myself that the foods I allowed myself to eat, the movement I did, the various plans I followed were all health-based. And actually, I was very sick.
I'm sorry that, like you say, such a lonely place and such suffering,
Yes.
avoidable suffering. Yeah. And also, it entirely makes sense in a neoliberal worldview. It completely makes sense. Because we're told, so this whole idea of health, that this construct of health is presented to us as something that is overwhelmingly overdetermined by what we eat and drink. Yeah, so diet, smoking, alcohol, exercise, and maybe a bit of mindfulness thrown in, and that in itself, and it's completely achievable, and it's our moral obligation to do that. So you're not allowed to feel like you're a worthwhile person unless
Unless you
you're
travel.
pursuing whatever the current guidelines are for this. And that, you probably know, that's known as healthism, this ideology of healthism. Yeah. And it's enshrined in the World Health Organization, where we're meant to be working, like health is like one step short of enlightenment, like this complete state of like physical and mental, well-being, which ought inherently excludes most of the world's population. A lot of people will never be well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what it does is it sets up this way of viewing the world where we've got the healthy, worthwhile people, of where we're trying to be one, and it just erases all these other people. And that's why what I'm do is, if we challenge this, I'll often ask people, like, what does health mean to you? What would it mean to be well, to be healthy? So it's
That's a great
complicating,
question.
yeah. And then we can think of, like, if we think of prisons, is in a in a world where we can all flourish, does this involve giving prisoners like organic food, or does it involve working against what's known as carcerality, against systems that imprison particular groups of the population? So it's like, am I working for a vision of the world that is foundationally different from what we have now? Or am I basically keeping the world the same and making sure everybody can eat according to guidelines? And it's the first. So it's to keep asking questions of ourselves and each other that refuse the premise of what we're presented as. This is the way the world is, and we're just going to try and tweak it a bit and improve it. I'm like, no, this is the way the world is. It doesn't have to be like this. And it's not like this everywhere. We do have examples of like mutual aid, of disability justice, fat liberation, some absolutely fantastic spaces where you go to flourish in community. That's what I want. And food is a brilliant vehicle for those conversations. But eating it according to guidelines, and the whole thing of like eating according to guidelines, who are the guidelines written for?
Well, assuming we're all the same, I suppose.
Yeah. But so it's presented as if it's universally appropriate. If we look at like the
Yeah.
Eat Well plate, for instance, so we have this idea, healthy eating guidelines, general population, this is neutral, it's the best fit for most people. Rubbish, complete rubbish. If you spend time looking at it, we can figure out this is actually written, it's written to provide the nutrient profile needed for a thin, cis male, non-disabled, elite adult. That's what it's written for. So this is the whole idea of who's at the centre. It's presented the invisible standard. It's written for whiteness. It's written for maleness. It's written for cisness.
I wonder what percentage of the population that actually covers. We're told it's for everyone, but it's actually only for this small percentage of the population.
And then what happens is, you know, I meet people who are desperate, really, like they believe that if they don't follow this, that they're harming themselves, but maybe they've got terrible gut problems and a whole load of veg is not great. Or maybe maybe they're getting food from the food bank and it's just not a thing. It's not possible. So they end up blaming themselves and feeling bad about it, and also feeling very anxious. And of course, we should have a right to food agenda. Everybody should be able to feed themselves and their families and their communities with dignity, of course. But what the current way of teaching nutrition does is it exaggerates the role of nutrients on population health. So it misses the fact that, like you mentioned earlier, like stress impacts hypertension, loneliness, air pollution, war, all these things.
Yeah, it's for me personally, when I was following quite rigidly with a lot of perfectionism, all the things that I thought I was supposed to do for health and to reach that golden globe of I'll be happy when, I was so anxious, so stressed, so self-critical and self-hating, because of course I couldn't do it perfectly, because that's impossible. And it's only through my recovery, through learning, that I have this incredible vessel that I live in, that if I listen, it tells me what I need. It doesn't follow an eat well plate, it just knows. And letting go of all the talk out there, learning that actually you can have health at every size, and learning how to listen and communicate with my own body and to eat according to what my body's telling me I want. My health overall, well, my definition of health has dramatically changed, and how I feel in my life, in my day-to-day life, is so different, because I feel peaceful, I feel happy, I feel like who I am and what I am is absolutely good enough. But yet when I was trying to be good enough, I never felt good enough. And it's quite incredible how what we're fed is health can be so bad for us, can make us feel so unwell.
And I think what you've done there as well is you've drawn attention to how what's called like the deep logic. So the deep logic is there's healthy and there's unhealthy, there's good and there's bad. There's perfect and there's like utter failure. And it's that, for me, it's that deep logic. And one of the things, if I'm working with people who are like really stuck around food, so they've got like healthy and unhealthy ideas, and I'd be like, has anything ever moved from the healthy to the unhealthy? And it's like getting, and I know like people in Overeaters Anonymous will have these particular lists, and it's just getting, it's not trying to destabilize what is helping people keep safe in the world, but it is letting people know there's another way. So I do a lot of work around expanding beyond binary thinking. And I think the other thing that's absolutely core in that is self-compassion and respect.
Yes.
That even if I don't respect myself, to know that I am a human being and I'm worthy of respect. That was a big thing for me in me, like changing my mindset, was self-compassion, was just training myself not to beat myself up. And it took ages, but I managed over time to replace the constant self-critical script with another script. and just to interrupt it, not to like try and beat it down, but just to interrupt it.
The current system encourages self-criticism in a way by
It's
making
massive.
us feel
Yeah,
we're so accountable for it.
yeah. And I think I do want to be accountable, but um, but this idea, and I think like people say, well, is it my fault? I'm like, well, is it my fault that I've got brown hair? So it's again, it's challenging the deep premise, and also I think that and to complicate the idea of body signals a little bit, that for some people they do have access to body signals in a way that's really useful to them, and for other people it's not, either it's not possible, like people with a head injury, for example,
Yes.
people people who are neurodivergent might not as well. And another thing that I started to bring into my work was to recognize that body signals are socially shaped, so that body shame is always misplaced. Because if we're like listening to our body signals and I feel like really shamed or disgusted with myself, like that's not, like, where am I going to go with that? So I think it's this idea that what we feel is like this, is this an ultimate truth, which again takes the body out of relationship. So it's a very particular way of constructing the world. It's known as atomistic, where people are like, everybody's like standalone, and it's my job to take my standalone body and make it as healthy and as wealthy as possible. And too bad if I trash everybody else or the planet in the process. Whereas if I think through into, and it doesn't, like, too bad if somebody, you know, if what I do impacts somebody else and they just need to, I don't know, get over themselves. Like that's not, that's not a great way of being in the world. Whereas if I think through interrelationship, then I'm porous. Whenever, like, we're always interacting,
Yes.
to challenge the status quo or to reinforce it. And so how do I approach that with more care and recognizing that we're socially shaped? And I think you talked earlier on about bringing in attention to social justice, and I think that can really help us if we think about knowledge creation. Like, if I feel I am the expert and I am entitled this knowledge and biomedicine is the one right way, that if I'm taught that my body signals are the be all and end all, there's no way I'm going to shift from that. It's not, I'm not going to soften that. And also that if I feel a really strong way that so as a white person, as a white-bodied person in a white supremacist society, I'm trained to be afraid of black men. That's, that's what my body signals are primed there. So if I take that as a truth, then I'm going to act in a racist way. So it's like trying to notice my body signals and say, oh, and be curious about them. What's going on here? What do I know from my experience? How is this shaped by my positionality? And just to bring that as a practice, and just imagine if that was the practice that we had collectively, how different in eating disorder spaces, and I think around intuitive eating, how different things would be.
Absolutely. Compassion and curiosity are two of the most important things, really, because we have to be curious to grow, to learn, to do things differently, to question things. But we also really need to have compassion for ourselves and for other people, because although we are all part of the same universe and part of a society, we are also individuals and different. And because we are as we are, it doesn't mean that that's right and somebody else is wrong. It's just different.
It's such a key. That like, not to always be figuring out, am I better or worse than you? Which is what we're, like you say, it's what we're trained to do. The whole healthy, unhealthy. It's a hierarchy. But yeah, like you say, just to meet people and be curious about our differences, and yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, what a great conversation. I'm learning so much from you as well. Thank you. I've loved this. I love learning. Um, So can you give me how you view health, as in what you grew up viewing health as, and how that has changed, and what you would view health as now?
Yeah. So I had an eating disorder when I was younger, and very much along the lines of you, that health was about getting it right, and
Yes,
getting it right was about whatever it was, you know,
which changes, let's face it,
macronutrients,
it's
you know, and exercise.
yeah.
And it was funny because I was asked once to write a chapter, and it was the first time I'd ever put my own story in, and I realised as I was writing it that the eating disorder, I mean, this might sound a bit melodramatic, but like it kept me alive, because what else was I going to do? I didn't have I didn't have other resources available to me at the time. So
I think
like there's
that's
consequences,
very
you know, there's
common. Yeah.
absolutely enduring consequences from it. And without that, it's always, I think this is always assumes that the person who's suffering or engaged in these like behaviors, that there's always something else that they could be doing that would be more life affirming, and there's not necessarily, not if they haven't got the support, you know. So I had about that
Mm.
very neoliberal idea of health, and these days I would when I these days I would talk about public health or population health, but I don't think health is a useful construct, because we just default in our imagination to this, really it's a colonial construct of the individual, the isolated individual, trying to like get all their biomedical metrics matched up to what they should be. And I don't think it's help as a way of organizing knowledge around collective well-being. I don't think it's helpful. So there's a concept that when I'm trying to think, I put an I, you know, like iPhone or whatever,
Mhm.
like eye health. And eye health, I think, it's the eat less, move more, be resilient. You know, where empowerment is actually, people mean self-esteem or self-confidence for it. They don't mean like an abolitionist public health. You know, they don't mean taking all the money from weight management and doing something radically different with it. Yeah, so
Mm.
I think of eye health, and then I might talk about population or public health, which for me is more, it has more of that collective in it. And then, there's lots of other knowledge, lots of different knowledge traditions where, and if we read, there's the Journal of Critical Dietetics, which is open access. There's some really brilliant work by Indigenous dietitians in there who question the like health doesn't translate into a lot of Indigenous languages. So every time I use it, I'm repressing a way of understanding the world. It's like, in a way, there's ways in which it functions as anti-blackness, because it represses, like you were saying, these other ways of being in the world, of thinking through connection. So I just try to be more to be like, what's the impact of the, if I use this word here, what impact will it have? And it might be in a one-to-one that I would use health, because it has to be useful. Like, what's the impact of this? And it can be really useful in a one-to-one, but then also within that, asking people, what does it mean to you? And so the phrase that I think with is this idea of the commons well, where in the commons well, instead of like working with 10 people, like, how can I help you be as healthy as you can be? How can I help you? It's getting together and think, okay, folks, there's 10 of us here. These are our resources. What do we want, and how are we going to go about it?
I love that. It's,
Thank you.
I was I was thinking as you were saying that, randomly everything began with a C, of what it means to me, both individually and collectively. And it was connection, care, compassion,
Lovely.
curiosity. And
Yeah.
that was what was coming up. It was nothing to
Wonderful.
do with
Yeah.
what you put in your body or how you move your body.
Yeah. How wonderful.
All begin
Yeah.
with C. I loved your eye health though. That's brilliant.
Well, it's just like, because otherwise I'm always like trying to salvage these terms that actually I think we should be composting this term because it keeps us, it's called a lock-in. It's when it stabilizes a way of thinking about something. And for me, it's a colonial lock-in. It stabilizes this very healthy, unhealthy, good, bad, this binary way of thinking. And in doing so, it erases it's called pluriversalism. When you were talking about um, which you might know already, but when you were taught, so we're taught this universalism, there's one right way, and it's this biomedical or colonial way. What you were talking about is pluriversalism. There's all these different ways of thinking things through. So all these different people that we meet, we don't need to figure out whether they're better or worse. There's all these different valuable ways of understanding things.
The life would actually be very boring if we weren't all different. Diversity is really beautiful. It just, I mean, it does make everything, I want to use the word colourful and just, yeah, alive. I love that. What would you like people to really take from this episode? If there was one part of it that you'd love for people to open up about, hear about, and be curious about, what would that be?
So I think it's about taking stories and experiences seriously. So what you're doing in the podcast is like increasing the reach of people's stories. So this is my story about knowledge creation and some of the information that I found really helpful in that and how I sort of got there. And then you've shared your story, because I think too often what happens is, and we've been thinking around, so-called healthy eating, we're given a story, we should all be doing this. And if I'm doing a workshop, and particularly if there's disabled people there, I'm like, so I put it the Eat Well plate and I just put it up and I'm like, okay, so how's it going? I don't even say anything, just say, how's it going? And people, like, they don't know whether to laugh or cry, you know? Because like, we all know it, but where are these stories? Where is the research into the adverse impact of the Eat Well plate? It doesn't exist. I found
I think there's so much
two
shame.
studies.
There's shame. We're made to, yeah, we feel shame if we're not able to do it.
Yeah, so it's that. It's like to make it places where we can have each other's backs in risking sharing what we know to be true for ourselves, which is a phrase I've heard Adrienne Marie Brown, and I'm a Quaker, and it's also in our advices and queries. Like, it's like, talk about your experience, be open to others, but value your experience. Because I think, and again, not that it's the be all and end all. So, for example, I might feel something, I might feel shame for something. Doesn't mean that I'm not going to interrogate it. But it's take it seriously and see how it connects to other things and use that as the basis for knowledge creation, not the experts out there, or it's academic or it's evidence-based practice, as if all these things are beyond scrutiny, because they're not. People know stuff. You get a group of people together and we know stuff together. And how I've come to think differently is by challenging everything that I was told, including like systems of thought like evidence-based practice. So it's that, make these spaces where we come together and just curious and gentle and gracious. And I think the interesting thing is where we disagree. It's great where we agree. That's heartening and reassuring and a relief and a break. It's fantastic. We need it. It's solace, it's nurture. But the really interesting thing is when there's people with similar worldviews where we disagree on something.
Yeah, so I think that disagreement is great so long as you're not sticking to the, well, I'm right and you're wrong.
Yeah.
I think it's great that we have different opinions, that we have different ways of seeing things. I think it's amazing. My youngest son, I always say to him that he lives outside the biscuit tin, because It's
I've not heard
wonderful.
that. Is that a phrase of yours? Or is it a
I
Bournemouth thing? I've
don't
not
know.
heard it before.
It's,
I
it's
love
wonderful
it.
that he doesn't think within, I suppose, the establishment of our society. He thinks outside the biscuit tin all the time. And I love it. I think it makes me think. It allows me to have more curiosity and say, ah, I hadn't thought of it from that perspective. Because when all's said and done, apart from birth, death, and gravity,
Yeah,
everything else is perspective. It's not truth, real truth. Everything is perspective. It's
yeah.
all of these things are somebody's point of view, somebody's perspective. So it's great to know and see and value that there's a huge diversity in those things.
Mm.
I find it quite exciting to learn different points of view.
Mm. And if I just go circle right back to the beginning. So I started off by saying that I thought I was missing something. And I realised it wasn't that I was missing, like, it wasn't that I was missing something, but my whole approach to making sense of the world was oppressive. It was binary. And it took me a long while to understand that I had to educate myself about coloniality, which is sort of like right around binary thinking and white supremacy. So it wasn't just that I was missing a few facts or something. It was my whole way of being in relationship to knowledge and knowledge creation needed to change. And that is an ongoing process.
Always. We get to learn and grow every day.
And
And it's
unlearn a
amazing.
bit. I've composted a lot.
Yes. Yeah. Like what is no
Yeah.
longer serving? Yeah, absolutely. How can people learn more about you and get in contact with you if they want to?
Um, so just before that, thank you for that
Yeah.
question. You've just reminded me we've got World Critical Dietetics. So to go to World, we've got a conference, but this might not come out in time. But look at the World Critical Dietetics website, and there's an open access journal, and you will find some of my work in there.
Oh,
And
amazing.
I'm really rubbish on social media, so I wouldn't spend too much time there. And I'm just picking up freelance work again. So I've just started offering courses and webinars again. And I have a series, the webinars are just an hour, and they're just like tasters really to introduce topics to people who, so I don't know where the learners, what background learners are coming from. So just to really pitch it to whoever's in the room there. So I've got things like healthism, nutritionism, informed consent. Yeah, just a series. And I'm really open. If people have got, it's a topics that people would like to suggest, I'm really open to that. I want to try and make it useful.
Oh, I love that. And can people see? I'm going to put your website on the show notes. So can people find out about that on your website?
Yeah, it's there. It's on there, yeah.
Amazing.
Oh.
Oh, this has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would really like to share?
Well, I just remembered something that listeners might enjoy is that, and it's something that's been really powerful for me in like metabolizing really painful emotions. You mentioned earlier that I write poetry and perform. So if you like, I could leave with just a few lines of poetry.
Oh, that would be
Would that be
absolutely
okay?
wonderful. So
Yeah.
that
So
would be amazing.
it's from a long poem that started off as, it starts off Dear Body. And when I wrote it, I would say, oh, I'm writing a series of poems, Dear Body. And for a long time, there was just one. But it was true. I had intended to write a series, and now there is like more. So this is from one of the longer ones. And it goes, it was addressed to some of it was addressed to dietitians. Dear dietitian, what I have learned is that warmth and regard and community are nutrients too. Health is decided by the roll call of our lives, our portion size of power, what it takes to safely claim identity, to house ourselves unshuttered in the bodies of our histories, to have hurt heard. Poetry is not a luxury, nor is self-worth. I'll stop there.
Wow.
And poetry is not a luxury is from the writer, the Black feminist lesbian writer, Audre Lorde. And if your listeners are not familiar with her stuff, she's brilliant. She's totally brilliant. Poetry and essays. And we were talking about the body. You'd find this online, the power of the erotic. Uses of anger and power of the erotic, if you look those up online. It's awesome.
Oh, will do. Thank you so much. You've
Thank you,
a
Julia.
Wonderful guest. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for making these spaces for stories.
And listeners, thank you so much for being here, and I will see you next week.